Hi, my name is Delia Carstens, and I'm from Westminster College in Salt Lake City, Utah, where I had the opportunity to work with my mentor, Marilise Cole-Ritchie, on my project Trauma-Informed Practice in the K-12 school setting. So a little bit about me. I grew up in the rural White Mountains of northern New Hampshire, where everyone appears to look and act just the same. But something that was a little bit different about me was that elementary was a place for me, especially to escape the stress seen at home. So just like my teachers provided me that safety and security, I wanted to provide other students the same. So I'm currently an elementary education major with a minor in special education. I also currently today work in Promise, South Salt Lake with a diverse group of middle schoolers who have a very large, diverse group of needs, where I've become interested in school psychology and behavioral analysis to best find the most appropriate ways to communicate with these students. So why is there a need for trauma-informed practices? Currently, today in the United States, 47% of children experience at least one adverse childhood experience, meaning harmful or unfavorable. Adverse childhood experiences can also be known as ACE. ACE are the potential or current events one is going through that could or is causing trauma. These ACEs are physical and emotional abuse, physical and emotional neglect, and household dysfunction such as mental illness, mother treated violently, incarcerated relatives, and substance abuse. We know that trauma has long-term effects on brain development, which causes students to feel significant delays academically and socially, which affect them throughout their entire lives moving forward. What is trauma? Trauma is an event that causes extreme stress. So before moving forward, I want to make it very clear that trauma comes in many forms and can affect people very differently. Depending on the area you grow up in, traumatic experiences can be more prevalent to others due to family history and stress levels. The two types of trauma we're going to be looking at today are complex trauma and psychological trauma. Complex trauma is trauma that has been consistent and has been repeated over a period of time. It's often invasive, interpersonal, and has a wide range of long-term impacts. It could be from severe childhood abuse, domestic abuse, to other forms of abuse. Psychological trauma is when your life experiences or events are perceived as harmful, and it creates intense distress. Most of the times we see that adolescents tend to experience psychological trauma, which can be formed from natural disasters to interpersonal violence. What are trauma-informed practices? Trauma-informed practices allow professionals to provide services to survivors who need help addressing their mental health. It's a framework approach of understanding, recognizing, and responding to actions, behaviors, and emotions. It's done through screening and interventions to build relationships and teach coping skills, while having a conversation about traumatic feelings and comparing them to current day behavior. Now I want to make it clear again that none of this is rushed or forced. All of this is done on the survivor's time. Trauma-informed practices can be used by teachers, doctors, healthcare professions, social workers, and people simply just like you and I. These relationships are done through clear communication and clear leadership that has an understanding of trauma and stress, compassion and dependability, culture of humility and responsiveness, safety and stability, collaboration and empowerment, and resiliency and recovery, while taking all personal experiences into account. Trauma-informed schools. So 7 years ago or so, any student who would demonstrate behavioral or emotional disturbances would be placed automatically in special education. In 2013, the state of California had 3.8% of its special education students classified just as having an emotional disturbance. With the continued new knowledge on ACEs, schools have decided to take this approach outside of the special education classroom and implement it to a whole schools. Schools who have taken on this trauma-informed approach must have staff and teachers educated on what trauma is. The schools must practice safety for staff and students, safe academically, emotionally, physically, and culturally. The schools also must be holistic, having the ability to see the full picture of the student Also having a strong sense of community that allow for opportunities to make connections to individuals who have shared experiences just as yourself. They also must be accountable, feeling connected and responsible for all students at all times. And they also must be adaptable, being able to adapt to all students' needs at all times as they shift throughout time. Schools who have taken on this rationale of trauma-informed practices have noticed higher academic outcomes, higher rates of safety, and improvements in social awareness, decision-making skills, relationship skills, coping skills, graduation rates, and improved attendance, and a decrease of physical aggression, office visits, and out-of-school suspensions. So my research question moving forward was, what is evidence of trauma-informed practice in the law and regulation manuals for children in the K-12 school setting? So school law and regulation manuals are what provide information on school discipline laws and administration regulation. In other words, it's an easier way for school-level personnel to understand current school discipline practices they must follow and the laws that go along with those practices. Every public school in the country must have a school's law and regulation manual that is created from the Department of Education, and I have pulled all of their newest forms of these manuals, which were created in April of 2019. For my method, I did a document analysis where I first created a list of texts to explore, and that was the law and regulation manuals we just discussed. I pulled from 8 different states. I pulled from New Hampshire, Massachusetts, North Carolina, Texas, California, Utah, Illinois, and South Dakota. I pulled from these 8 different states because they had a wide variety from northern east of the country all the way to the west coast of the country, but also they had a good balance of who has historically been red state or who has historically been a blue state, other words, Democratic or Republic. And then also I have a form of higher states with higher population and higher diversity, and also certain states with higher funding to lower school funding. Second, I considered how text will address questions. Third, I acknowledge and addressed any biases. So where were these manuals being used? Who's using these manuals? And then fourth, I checked for credibility. When was the manual created and who wrote the manual? Next, I was able to perform a data analysis where I did a form of coding called structured coding, where you first create research questions into themes, and then you create your list of codes that fit those research themes. So my main code for this project was trauma. Then I go through and I match found data to these codes. So is trauma mentioned? How is it mentioned? Where is it mentioned? In other words, the codes really lead my research in this case. And in order to collect the data, I used a cross-platform app called Deduce. So before I started coding, I had some expected results that practices were not being referred to as frequently as expected due to that trauma-informed practices are still new and little training is being granted. Also expected to see more practices mentioned in the states of California and Texas due to a larger diversity and larger population size. I expected to see more references in the state of Massachusetts due to the state has a large amount of school funding compared to other states. And I also expected to see more references in states who historically vote blue over states who historically vote red due to more of a progressive approach. So, my findings. Of course, unfortunately, trauma-informed practices, in my opinion, were not mentioned as frequently as much as they should be. We have a wide range of how much these practices were mentioned, all the way from 0 to 16. But 16 being the most, to me, is very little. It's very disappointing. I think trauma-informed practices should be mentioned more than just 16 times. In my findings, I also noticed that states like Texas and California, who had large population size, and large diversity size, it turns out it didn't play a huge role into the amount of practices being mentioned. Yes, Texas is the highest at 16, but California only has 8, and that's very little for how large their population truly is. Next, I noticed that it did not matter if a state was historically red or blue. Again, looking at Texas, who is historically a red swing state at 16, and then we can look all the way down at Illinois, who is a blue state and has 0 mentions. And then next, I looked at school funding per pupil. So if we look at the state of Massachusetts, who has the largest amount of school funding, just over $16,000, they have 14 mentions. But it turns out school funding does not play a huge role into this, because if we look at states like New Hampshire and Illinois, who are right in the $15,000 ballpark plus, they only have 2 to 0 mentions. So clearly school funding did not play a huge important role. Another thing while coding that I kept running into is that I noticed that definitions of certain practices were repeated multiple times in the manual with the same exact wording. So here is the state of California's manual, where I had a definition repeated twice on page 14 and page 100. And in this manual, it mentioned trauma only 8 times, but 4 out of those 8 are repeated definitions. So that even though that these pages or these documents are over 200 pages long, they're choosing not to provide new skills and new information to these teachers. Another thing I noticed moving forward in my findings was that trauma-informed practices are mentioned in a range of categories. Trauma-informed practices were mentioned while discussing grant programs, website resources, restraint protocol, transportation protocol, mental health prevention, sex ed and sexual abuse, access to training, bullying, cyberbullying, and continuing education after trauma. So for example, I expected to see that every manual would have continuing education after trauma, where they would mention trauma-informed practices, but unfortunately that was not the case. Only 2 out of the 8 manuals I went through actually mentioned continuing education after trauma. So like I said before, unfortunately trauma-informed practices are not being mentioned as frequently as expected. And due to these practices not being mentioned as frequently as expected, the tools and skills are not being mentioned to go along with how to have trauma-informed practices. And teachers and school personnel still do not have the tools needed to see the whole picture and they continue to only see positive versus negative behavior. So I would really like it if schools and teachers, administration, and policymakers would take note of this and take time to put more trauma-informed practices in these already lengthy law and regulation manuals. Moving forward in the future, I would love to see how teachers follow through with these guidelines, if they have any guidelines on trauma-informed care. I would also like to see teachers who do practice trauma-informed care, if they get any support from other teachers, their principals, and so on. And I would also like to see how students feel about their school climate and comparing school climates to ones that do have trauma-informed practices and ones that don't, and see if it really makes a huge impact on how the students feel day to day moving forward in school. So here are some of my references. And lastly, I would just like to give a big thanks to my mentor, Marilee Coles-Ritchie. I'd also love to thank the McNair Westminster staff and all of you who took the time for listening. Thanks.